On Chicago's South Side, there was one name that made people lower their voices whenever they spoke it. Cole Callahan. They called him the boss. They spoke of him the way people spoke of a force of nature, cold, powerful, and untouchable. But not one of them knew the truth. They didn't know that the most feared man on the South Side had spent 15 full years giving away everything he had: his youth, his dreams, his sleep, even the cleanliness of his own hands, all for the people he loved. His mother lived in a decent home because of him. His younger brother held a prestigious law degree because of him. His sister wore a doctor's coat because of him. And Cole kept only one thing for himself: the belief that every season of sacrifice would someday end, and that one day, his real life would finally begin. He was wrong. That evening, Cole came home early. In his coat pocket was the key to the house he had just bought, a wedding gift for the woman he was about to call his wife. He climbed the stairs, opened the bedroom door, and saw two people inside: the woman wearing the ring he had given her, and the younger brother he had raised, fed, and put through school until he became a successful man. 15 years of sacrifice collapsed inside a single doorway. But fate still hadn't finished with him, because what Cole saw in that room wasn't the worst of it. The worst was still lying quietly inside a file, and he wouldn't discover it until 3 days later. That is where this story begins. If this story touches your heart, please leave a like and share it with the people you love. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss Cole's journey in the minutes ahead. Now, the story begins. But to understand what happened in that room, we have to go back 15 years. To a bitterly cold November afternoon in Chicago, the day Patrick Callahan's coffin was lowered into the earth. Patrick had once been a name that carried weight on the South Side, but when he died, he left behind an organization as weakened and hollowed out as a house eaten through from within by termites, along with a debt so enormous that the men who had once sworn loyalty to him began finding excuses, one after another, not to appear. Everyone understood the one thing that didn't need to be said aloud: whoever took Patrick's chair would also take Patrick's debt. No one dared to accept it. Not one person. The gathering after the funeral took place in the family's old house, with people coming and going, offering condolences in the voices of men who were calculating their next move. Then a man in a gray coat appeared. He hadn't come to express sympathy. He represented the people Patrick still owed, and he waited patiently until the crowd had thinned before approaching the dead man's eldest son and quietly asking to speak with him in private. Cole followed him into the back hallway, where his mother couldn't hear them, where his brother and sister weren't present, where there were only two men and a single question. With the careful politeness of someone who knew perfectly well he wasn't being polite, the man asked when the family intended to begin repaying the debt. Cole was 19 years old then. He had never signed a loan document in his life. He looked at the man standing before him, and something quietly settled into place inside his chest. It wasn't courage. It wasn't anger. It was something stiller than either of those. A brutal clarity. The clarity of someone who had just understood, fully and with no room left for illusion, that no one was coming to carry the burden for him. He said, "Give me time. Not speak to my mother. Not, someone will contact you. Give me time." 4 words, and an entire life changed direction. The man studied the thin young man before him for a long moment, as though weighing how much those 4 words were worth, then nodded and left. Cole went back inside, rolled up his sleeves, and finished washing the dishes left from the funeral reception, because someone had to do it. That night, after everyone in the house had fallen asleep, Cole sat alone at the kitchen table. In front of him was an envelope that had been opened 3 weeks earlier. Inside was an acceptance letter to the architecture program at a university he had dreamed of attending since he was 14, along with a partial scholarship, the reward for all those sleepless nights spent drawing until his pencils had worn down to stubs. He read the letter one final time, slowly, the way a person looks at the face of someone they love for the last time before the coffin lid is closed. Then he flicked open his father's old lighter, touched the flame to the corner of the page, and dropped it into the sink. The fire slowly consumed every line of print. It consumed the name of the university, the signature from the admissions office, and even the future that had once carried the name Cole Callahan, until nothing remained but a small, fragile mound of ash. He turned on the faucet, washed it away, and didn't cry. From the dark doorway behind him, Sal DeMarco had been standing there for some time. The man who had once been Patrick's right hand had seen everything, from the conversation in the hallway to the flame burning in the sink. He offered no words of comfort and no attempt to stop him, because he understood that there were moments when any spoken word would be an insult. He simply stepped forward, placed the key to Patrick's office on the wooden table, then moved back one step and took the exact position of a protector standing behind his leader. The South Side didn't know it yet, but that night, it had gained a new boss. A 19-year-old boss who didn't want that chair, who hadn't chosen that chair, who was simply the only person in that house who understood that if he didn't sit in it, the men outside would come knocking, and the one who opened the door would be his mother, his younger brother, or his little sister, who hadn't even finished high school. Some men choose power, and some men are chosen by power on the night they burn their own dreams in a kitchen sink, so the people they love can sleep in peace. For the first 3 years, Sal DeMarco stood beside the chair far more often than Cole sat in it. Outsiders assumed the old man was pulling the strings of a young puppet, but those close enough to hear the conversations inside Patrick's old office understood the truth was the opposite. Sal taught Cole how to read a room, but every decision belonged to Cole, even the wrong ones. And it was precisely because he accepted responsibility for those wrong decisions that by the 4th year, no one in the organization called him the Callahan kid anymore. They called him Mr. Callahan, and they lowered their voices when they said it. To understand what Cole's 15 years looked like, there is no need to tell all 15 years. It is enough to tell one day, because through all that time, every day was a copy of the one before it, like a prison sentence that had forgotten its release date. At 5 o'clock in the morning, while Chicago was still buried beneath the cold gray darkness of its working-class neighborhoods, the lamp on Cole's desk was already burning. He sat with the ledgers, checking every number twice, comparing every payment and expense until everything matched, because he had learned from the wreckage his father left behind that a man might survive his enemies, but no one survived his own carelessness. At 7 o'clock, he met with the men who managed each territory, and those meetings were strangely brief. Cole didn't shout, didn't threaten, didn't pound his fist on the table. He simply listened, asked 1 or 2 precise questions, then fell silent and looked at the man across from him. And it was that silence that made even the most seasoned men confess the very thing they had intended to hide. His father's power had lived in loud laughter and heavy slaps on the shoulder. Cole's power lived in the fact that no one could guess what he was thinking, and no one wanted to find out what happened when they guessed wrong. But what truly kept him in that chair wasn't the Callahan blood running through his veins. What kept him there was something so simple it was almost absurd. He paid his debts on time. Every payment, every month, every year, his father's enormous debt was carved down layer by layer, never late, never short, never needing to be mentioned twice. The creditors who had come to the funeral with the eyes of vultures slowly began to look at him differently. Because in a world where promises were worth less than paper, a man who kept his word year after year became an asset no one wanted to destroy. His father had been loved and had died in debt. His son didn't need to be loved. He needed to be trusted, and he earned that trust at a price no ledger ever recorded, because the money in those books, after the debts were paid, didn't flow toward Cole. It flowed toward a prestigious law school at Georgetown, where Brendan Callahan learned how to tie a proper necktie, how to speak to men whose names were carved into buildings, how to become a gentleman without ever having to ask where his tuition came from. It flowed toward the medical school where Bridget worked through exhausting shifts, the youngest daughter who received the same brief message from Cole each time tuition was due. It's taken care of. Focus on your studies. It flowed toward his mother's new house in a quiet neighborhood on the west side, where Eileen moved after the old house held too many memories she didn't want to keep, where she sat by the window with church services and phone calls to check on the neighbors, living a clean and respectable life, built with money she never questioned, and had probably decided long ago she didn't want to understand. The whole family accepted Cole's money in the same way people accepted air, breathing it in every day without ever thinking to say thank you. Brendan called when a payment was due. Bridget called when a payment was due. His mother called when the roof leaked, or the fence needed repainting. No one called to ask whether he had eaten, whether he had slept, or how he survived inside the world he had to enter every day so that those other calls could always be answered. And Cole never blamed them, because he believed that was what it meant to be the eldest son. He stood in the darkness, so the people he loved could stand in the light. And one day, when every debt had been paid, when his brother and sister were secure, when his mother was safe, he would step out of that darkness and begin the part of life that belonged to him. He believed it the way people believed a promise, even though the only person who had ever made that promise was Cole himself. There was only one stretch of each day that truly belonged to him, and that was the time after midnight, when the phone had gone silent, when the city had grown tired, when he sat alone at his desk and pulled a worn leather notebook from the drawer. There were no numbers inside it. There were drawings, rendered in pencil with every window ledge measured and imagined in detail. Old Chicago buildings restored in his mind. Red brick facades returned to their original color, steel beams straightened, grand halls filled with light again. Over 15 years, the notebook grew thicker page by page, and not one of the buildings inside it was ever built. He drew them the way a prisoner carved marks into a wall, not to count the days already lost, but to remind himself that somewhere beyond the wall, another life was still waiting. Then he closed the notebook, returned it to the drawer, turned off the lamp, and slept for a few short hours before 5 o'clock came again, carrying with it another day exactly like the one before, until the year he turned 32, when a woman named Whitney Prescott entered his life. And for the first time in 13 years, Cole Callahan allowed himself to believe that the release date of his long sentence might finally be drawing near. Whitney Prescott entered Cole's life at a charity auction he attended for business, and she attended because it was the sort of place where people like her were expected to be seen. The Prescott family had once been a name among Chicago's elite. Once was the most important word, because by Whitney's generation, the money was gone, and all that remained was the family name, the connections, and an ability polished over many generations. The ability to stand in the middle of an elegant room as though she had been born to belong there. She was beautiful in a calculated way, intelligent in the way of a woman who knew exactly when to appear less intelligent than she was. And when she smiled at Cole for the first time over the rim of her wineglass, the man who had spent his life reading, everyone seated across from him at a negotiating table, suddenly forgot how to read. Perhaps it was because, in 13 years, no one had ever looked at him as though he were something intriguing, instead of something frightening. They became engaged after a year, and if those 2 years of engagement had to be told, 3 glimpses would be enough. The first was the parties. Whitney loved parties, and every time she introduced Cole to her friends, her explanation came out as smoothly as though she had practiced it in front of a mirror. Cole works in real estate. Technically, it wasn't untrue. His organization did own many buildings, but the way she said it quickly and immediately changed the subject was like someone brushing past a stain on a tablecloth, and Cole noticed it the very first time, because he had built his life on noticing the things other people tried to hide. He said nothing. He told himself she was protecting him. That caution was wise, that no one announced her future husband's real profession in the middle of a crowded room. The second glimpse was the look in her eyes. Once, during dinner with a group of Whitney's old friends, a woman casually asked about Cole's family, what his parents did, and where he had grown up. It was an ordinary question at any dinner table in the world, but before Cole could answer, he caught Whitney's eyes sliding toward him, a look that lasted less than a second, but carried an entire plea. "Don't tell them the truth." He smiled and said his father had died young, that he had grown up on the South Side, and that his mother now lived peacefully on the West Side. Every word was true. It was simply a version of the truth, with all the sharp edges filed smooth. The dinner passed pleasantly. In the car on the way home, Whitney took his hand and praised him for handling it well, the way someone might praise an employee who had successfully passed an interview, and Cole looked through the window as the South Side drifted by beneath the yellow streetlights, the neighborhood that had raised him and that was now, within his own life, becoming something that needed to be handled carefully. The third glimpse was the sentence spoken across the dinner table. That evening, there were only the two of them in Whitney's apartment, with candles burning, good wine poured, and the promise of a gentle night. She talked about the future, the wedding, the houses they might own, and then, as casually as though she were discussing the color of the curtains, she set down her glass and said, "I need a man who can walk into a ballroom without making everyone lower their eyes." The room fell silent for a moment. Cole looked at her and waited for her to correct herself, waited for her to say that wasn't what she meant, but Whitney merely looked back at him with the clear eyes of someone who believed she had said something entirely reasonable. And Cole did what he had done for 15 years, with every pain that entered his life. He swallowed it. He nodded, poured more wine, changed the subject, and allowed that sentence to sink to the bottom of his heart, where it settled beside the letter he had burned, beside the buildings he had never built, beside all the things he had taught himself not to look at for too long. But he didn't sleep that night. He sat by the window until nearly dawn, and for the first time, two ideas that had always seemed opposed to each other came together in his mind and formed a plan. Whitney wanted a clean man, and Cole had wanted to leave that chair from the first day he sat in it. So why not? His father's debt had only a few final payments remaining. His brother and sister were grown. His mother was safe. The season of sacrifice, as he had always promised himself, had finally reached its end, and Whitney's cruel sentence, instead of awakening him to the truth, became the final excuse he needed to begin. The next morning, Cole called Sal into his office, closed the door, and told the man who had stood behind him for 13 years that he was getting out. Not immediately, but step by step, over 3 years, so quietly that no one would realize what was happening until everything was finished. Sal listened to the end, remained silent for a long time, and then asked only one question. "Are you sure?" When Cole nodded, Sal nodded with him, because he had been waiting for that answer since the night he watched a teenage boy burn his acceptance letter in the kitchen sink. The plan was set in motion, building by building, account by account, asset by asset. Everything was quietly separated from the old world and transferred into legitimate structures. One company nested inside another, documents layered over documents. A legal maze that required the hand of a brilliant and absolutely trustworthy lawyer to build. And Cole, the man who trusted no one in business, who checked every number twice, who had survived 15 years by never placing his life in another person's hands, broke that rule exactly once. He entrusted the entire file to the only lawyer he believed he would never need to investigate. The man who shared his blood, the man whose Georgetown degree had been paid for, with the very money that now needed to be made clean. His younger brother, Brendan Callahan. Because some forms of trust don't need a reason. Blood is enough. Cole believed that with all the innocence still left inside, a man who had never been allowed to be innocent, and he would pay for that belief on the night he stood frozen in a bedroom doorway 3 years later. From that night on, Cole never returned to the apartment. He went straight back to his office, and for 3 days, he didn't sleep. It wasn't the restless sleeplessness of a man tossing and turning in bed, but the quiet wakefulness of a man sitting motionless in a chair, the lights left off, his phone face down on the desk, watching darkness slowly become dawn, and then darkness again, 3 full cycles in all. Sal brought food, set it down, and left without asking a question. He had watched Cole endure his father's funeral, survive wars over territory, and pass through nights when a single wrong decision could cost him everything. But he had never seen this expression before, the face of a man who wasn't angry, wasn't in pain, but simply empty, like a house stripped of every piece of furniture in a single night. On the surface of the desk, the key to the new house remained exactly where Cole had placed it when he came in, neat, shining, innocent, a wedding gift for a wedding that no longer existed. He didn't put it away, and he didn't throw it away. He simply left it there. And from time to time during those 3 days, his eyes passed over it and then moved away again, the way someone avoids looking at a wound whose bandage they aren't yet ready to remove. His phone vibrated a total of 17 times over those 3 days, every call from the same name. Whitney. He didn't answer a single one. By the second day, the calls became less frequent and turned into messages. And Cole read every one of them, word by word, in the darkness of his office. Not one began with the words, "I'm sorry." The first told him he was making too much of everything. The third said adults should know how to sit down and have a civilized conversation. The 7th blamed his absence, saying he had married his work and had never truly intended to marry her, saying that when a woman was starved of attention and went looking for warmth somewhere else, he needed to ask himself why. With every message Cole read, something inside him grew colder, not the coldness of forgiveness, but the coldness of metal removed from a furnace and hardening into its final shape. Then, on the 3rd night, the last message arrived, and it contained only 2 sentences. "Do you really think I could spend my whole life as the wife of a man like you? Mud is still mud, even when it is covered in gold." Cole read the message 3 times. Then he set the phone down, straightened in his chair, and the strange thing was that the pain he had been waiting for never came. In its place came clarity, the same brutal clarity that had found him once before in the hallway after his father's funeral, the feeling of a man who had just seen the whole truth and no longer had anywhere to hide from it. The woman to whom he had planned to give the rest of his life had never loved him. She loved the safe and hated the key that opened it. Fine, he thought. then let it end cleanly. On the morning of the 4th day, Cole shaved, changed his clothes, and did the first thing he had done in 3 days. He called the private law office handling the paperwork for the house and made a simple request. Remove Whitney Prescott's name from every document connected to the wedding gift, cancel every pending transfer, and do it as quickly as possible. Under ordinary circumstances, it would have taken no more than an afternoon. But near the end of the day, the lawyer called back, and there was a carefulness in his voice that Cole had heard often enough in his life to know something was wrong. The lawyer said he couldn't remove anyone's name because, on paper, the house no longer belonged to Cole. Cole was silent for 2 seconds, then told him to say it again, slowly, and the lawyer repeated it, slowly, layer by layer, like peeling an onion. The house was held by a subsidiary company. That subsidiary belonged to a parent company. The parent company sat within the asset structure Cole himself had authorized for his 3-year transition plan. Up to that point, everything still matched the original design. But the person listed as the final controlling authority over the entire structure, the person with the legal power to decide the fate of the house, and not only the house, but nearly all the legitimate assets that had been converted over the previous 3 years, wasn't Cole Callahan. It was Brendan Callahan. The documents changing control had been signed, notarized, and properly registered, legal down to the final period, and all of it had been completed 8 months earlier. 8 months. Cole stood beside the office window with the phone pressed to his ear, looking down at the stream of cars in the street without seeing any of them, and in his mind, the scattered pieces of the previous 8 months began sliding into place with a cold, sickening click. The signatures his younger brother had brought to him personally because the paperwork was urgent. The thick files Brendan had smiled over and told him to sign, saying he had read every page, asking who Cole could trust if he couldn't trust his own brother. The questions Whitney had asked about his plan to leave the business, posed with the concern of a future wife. Questions that, in hindsight, had all circled the same points. When would it be finished? Where would the assets be kept? Whose name would be on them? The affair he had witnessed through that bedroom doorway hadn't been one moment of weakness between two people who had lost control. It had been the final step of a plan that had been running for 8 months. Drawn up by the hand of a Georgetown-trained lawyer whose education had been paid for with Cole's own money, and Cole, the man who had spent his entire life trusting no one, had personally signed every document that betrayed him because the man placing the pen in his hand carried the name Callahan. He had asked to cancel a wedding gift, and that one small thread had unraveled the entire spool. The lawyer on the other end asked, "Mr. Callahan, are you still there? We need to discuss our options." Cole looked at the key still resting on the desk, and when he answered, his voice was so calm that even he didn't recognize it. "I'm still here," he said. "Prepare every document for me. I want to know exactly what my brother has taken from me." That Sunday, Cole drove to his mother's house on the west side, with a thick file resting on the passenger seat. A file he had read so many times that he knew every page by heart. He hadn't come to make a scene. He had come because some part of him, the part that was still the 19-year-old eldest son washing dishes after the funeral, still believed that when the truth was placed on the family dinner table, the family would stand with the truth. Sunday dinner was a tradition Eileen had kept for many years, and that evening, everyone was there. His mother sat at the head of the table with her familiar rosary beside her plate. Bridget arrived late, still carrying the exhaustion of a hospital shift, and Brendan sat there in a necktie, calm and composed, pouring wine for their mother like a devoted son in the portrait of a perfect family. He watched Cole enter with the file in his hand, and not a single muscle in his face moved. In that moment, before anyone had spoken a word, Cole understood that his younger brother wasn't afraid, and a man who had taken nearly everything from his own brother without fear was either a fool or someone who had already calculated every possible way out. Brendan had never been a fool. Cole placed the file in the middle of the table beside the plate of roasted potatoes and said in an even voice, neither rising nor falling, that he wanted the entire family to know something. Over the past 3 years, he had transferred all his assets into legitimate channels so he could leave the old life behind. The person he had trusted to handle the documents was Brendan, and 8 months earlier, Brendan had quietly transferred control of the entire body of assets into his own name, legally, carefully, down to every final period. When Cole finished speaking, the room became so quiet that the clock on the kitchen cabinet could be heard ticking. Bridget was the first to move, and what she did was lower her eyes to her plate and stare at it as though the answer to everything might be hidden somewhere between the slices of potato. She remained that way for nearly the rest of the dinner. The little sister he had raised into a doctor didn't ask him a single question. Eileen looked at the file as though it were something filthy that someone had carried into her home. Then her hand reached for the rosary, and her fingers began moving from bead to bead, steady and practiced, the gesture she always made whenever life demanded something more difficult from her than prayer. She didn't open the file. She didn't ask Brendan a single thing. She looked at her eldest son and said in a soft voice, as though she were soothing a child, that he was the older brother and had to be the bigger person, that family matters should be settled privately, that he shouldn't make this into something larger, because his brother still had his whole career ahead of him. Cole listened to every word fall, and he felt that none of them were new. They were only another version of the same sentence she had spoken to him all his life. When he gave up his toys, when he gave up his share of the food, when he gave up college, when he gave up his youth, the only difference was that this time, what he was being asked to surrender to his younger brother was everything that remained of his life. Then Brendan finally spoke, and he didn't deny a single word, which was the coldest part of all. He wiped his mouth with his napkin, leaned back in his chair, looked directly into his brother's eyes, and said that Cole was telling the story as though he were the victim. But honestly, no one had ever forced him to sacrifice anything. He had chosen it himself. He had chosen to sit in that chair, chosen to repay their father's debts, chosen to support the entire family. No one had ever held a knife to his throat, and now Brendan was simply protecting those assets from Cole's past. It was better for the documents to be held in the name of a respectable lawyer than in the name of a man like him. Cole should be thanking him. Every sentence Brendan spoke came in the voice of a man who had rehearsed it, clear, polished, effortless, and Cole sat there realizing just how perfectly his brother had built the trap, because Brendan was half right. Every document was legal, and if Cole tried to reclaim the assets through the courts, he would have to explain where they had come from. He would have to drag every dollar of the past 15 years into the light. He would have to strike the match and burn himself with his own hands, and burn his mother, Bridget, and all the innocent people living in houses purchased with that money along with him. Suing his brother meant setting himself on fire. Brendan knew that. Brendan had built the entire plan around one certainty. The eldest brother who had spent his whole life protecting the family would never dare pull the family down with him. And he had won. Cole looked around the dinner table once, at his mother moving through the rosary beads, at his sister staring at her plate, at his brother watching him with the eyes of a man who had delivered checkmate, and he didn't argue another word. He stood, picked up the file, thanked his mother for dinner, and walked toward the door. No one tried to stop him. That was the detail he carried with him through the entire drive home. Not Brendan's words, not his mother's rosary, but the fact that he had crossed the room, opened the door, stepped outside, and not one voice had called after him. During the next 30 days, Cole did exactly 3 things: cleanly, quietly, and decisively, the way he had handled everything else in his life. First, he called Sal into the office, placed on the desk the same office key Sal had set before him 15 years earlier, and said that what remained of the organization belonged to him now. "I'm finished. You deserve it more than anyone." Sal looked at the key, then looked at Cole, and for the first time in 15 years, the old man reached out and shook his leader's hand, as though he were shaking hands with a free man. Second, Cole went to the bank and canceled every automatic transfer that had continued without interruption through all those years. The monthly payment to his mother, the financial support for Bridget, everything, without warning and without explanation, because people who had never asked where the money came from didn't need to be told when it stopped coming. Third, he gave up the apartment he had been renting, disconnected his old phone number, and vanished from their lives without a word of farewell, carrying only one suitcase of clothes, a savings account in his own name, and a worn leather notebook with frayed corners. Cole's new apartment was on the 3rd floor of an old building in Bridgeport, with 1 bedroom, a small kitchen, and windows overlooking rows of metal rooftops and the brick chimneys of the working-class neighborhood. The real estate agent had looked almost apologetic as she led him upstairs, because she had no idea who the neatly dressed man in front of her was. She only saw him glance once around the empty room, nod, and agree to rent it without bargaining. On his first night there, Cole lay on a mattress placed directly on the floor, listening to the elevated train pass 2 blocks away, and laughed alone in the darkness, a dry, brief sound that held neither joy nor bitterness. 15 years earlier, He had been a 19-year-old boy sleeping in a house whose door the creditors were preparing to knock on. 15 years later, after paying off that debt in full, after raising his brother and sister into a lawyer and a doctor, after buying his mother a house, after ruling an entire stretch of the South Side where every room fell silent the moment he entered, he was once again lying on a mattress on the floor of an empty apartment, and everything he owned in the world could fit inside one suitcase and a number in a bank account so small that the men who had once feared him would never have believed it. People often thought being left with nothing meant losing money. During those first nights, Cole understood that being left with nothing was something else. It was what happened when every role a man had ever played was taken from him. Eldest son, provider, bearer of debt, boss, future husband. And he was forced to stand before whatever remained, the part of himself that had never been given a name. For the first week, he barely left the apartment. He didn't give his new phone number to anyone except Sal and the lawyer. He cooked simple meals, washed dishes, folded clothes, small physical tasks he hadn't had time to do in 15 years, and he discovered that only while doing those little things did his mind finally agree to become quiet. Then one morning, while shaving, Cole stopped and looked at himself in the bathroom mirror. Truly looked. Something he hadn't done in a very long time. The man in the glass was 34 years old, with a few strands of gray beginning to show at his temples, lines around his eyes deeper than his age should have allowed, and an ancient weariness in his gaze that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. He stood there for a long time without judgment and without self-pity, simply looking at himself the way someone might look at an old acquaintance seen again after many years, and a thought came to him plainly, without ceremony. This was a man who had passed through a very dark place and was trying to find his way out. He wasn't out yet, but he was looking, and immediately after that came another thought, firmer than the first, more like a decision than a hope. I'm going to be all right. He washed his face, dried it, and for the first time in weeks, opened the suitcase, took out the worn leather notebook, and placed it on the kitchen table. But he didn't open it yet. There was something he had to do first, something he had postponed since the day he left. Among everything Brendan had stolen through the corporate structure, there was one thing that remained outside it, something so small and worthless in his brother's eyes that no one had bothered to touch it. It was a deposit agreement held personally in the name of Cole Callahan, signed more than a year earlier, giving him the right to purchase a crumbling old building on a corner in Bridgeport, exactly 10 minutes on foot from the apartment he was renting. He had discovered it by chance while driving past one day. A 3-story building constructed early in the previous century, its red brick darkened with age, its arched windows boarded over, its roof sagging to one side. The kind of property investors looked at and saw only demolition costs, while Cole had stood on the sidewalk and seen the very thing he had been drawing in the leather notebook for more than a decade. He had paid the deposit quietly, without telling Whitney or anyone else, telling himself that this would be the first project of his new life once he had left the old one behind, a gift for the one person to whom he had never given anything, himself. Now that new life had arrived sooner and more cruelly than he had expected, but the building was still standing, and the deadline to complete the purchase was only 2 weeks away. The problem was that buying the property outright, along with paying the minimum cost required to keep it from collapsing during the coming winter, would consume nearly all his savings. Not part of it, nearly all of it. After signing, he would live with the same uncertainty as an ordinary laborer, with no way back, no hidden reserve, no safety net, all the things he had never once allowed himself to be without. Any sensible man would have told him to keep the money, live quietly for a few years, and wait for a better time. Cole had been sensible for 34 years. He had been sensible for his whole family, sensible for the entire organization, and all that good sense had brought him to a mattress on the floor of an empty apartment. That afternoon, he walked 10 minutes and stood before the old building, his hands in the pockets of his coat, looking up at 3 floors of red brick in the pale light of late autumn. Wind moved through the boarded windows with a loose, rattling sound. A patch of plaster had broken away near the foundation. The whole structure looked like an old animal, abandoned in the middle of the street, ugly to everyone except one man. Cole stood there so long that an elderly woman walking her dog turned to look back at him. He didn't see a ruin. He saw a strong frame beneath decaying skin. He saw the original arches of the windows, still proud and beautiful beneath the humiliation of the boards. He saw that the building resembled him so closely it was almost shameless, judged by its battered appearance, valued only by the cost of tearing it down. while inside, the structure was still standing, still straight, still waiting. The following morning, Cole sat in a notary's office, read the contract twice out of old habit, then signed his name with a slow, steady hand, and transferred nearly the last money he had in the world. The notary congratulated him on his real estate purchase. Cole folded the papers, placed them inside his coat, and said thank you. But in his mind, what had just taken place wasn't a purchase. It was a declaration made to himself that people could take nearly everything from him, but there was one thing beyond every corporate structure, every fraudulent signature, every treacherous hand: the ability to stand in the middle of ruins and begin to build. 15 years earlier, a 19-year-old boy had used that ability to rebuild an entire family from a funeral and a debt. Now, the 34-year-old man would use it one more time, this time for himself. On paper, the old building had 3 abandoned floors and only one tenant still holding on at street level. A small diner with a hand-painted wooden sign that read, Marin's Kitchen, its paint peeling at one corner. The day Cole arrived with the new keys to inspect the entire building again, he pushed open the diner door just before noon, and the woman behind the counter looked up at him with an expression he recognized immediately, because he had seen it all his life in people who had been backed into a corner. The look of someone waiting for bad news who had already practiced how to receive it so it might hurt a little less. She was about 28, with her hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck, her apron clean despite its faded color, and both hands reddened by dishwater and kitchen steam. She wiped her hands on the apron, came around the counter, and spoke plainly in the calm voice of someone who had rehearsed the sentence in front of a mirror. If he was the new owner, she asked him to tell her immediately how long she had before she needed to leave. She only wanted enough time to warn the elderly regulars who still came there for lunch, because they deserved to know before arriving to find the door locked. There was no begging and no story of hardship, only a practical request delivered with her chin slightly raised. Cole studied her for a moment, then looked around the small diner, at the 8 sets of old tables and chairs scrubbed clean down to every groove in the wood, at the chalkboard listing the day's special in careful handwriting, and then he did the last thing she expected. He pulled out a chair at the table beside the window, sat down, and asked what she was serving that day. The woman stood still for 2 seconds, as though she had to translate the question into a language she understood, then turned toward the kitchen without another word. 10 minutes later, she placed a plate of stew with mashed potatoes and a slice of buttered toast in front of him. Cole ate slowly, finished everything, and didn't speak throughout the meal. When he was done, he placed his knife and fork neatly together, left money on the table, stood, put on his coat, and before pushing open the door, turned back and said only one word: delicious. It wasn't the polite kind of praise people offered out of habit. Then he left. The woman remained behind the counter, watching the back of his gray coat disappear beyond the glass, unaware that the man who had just walked away had once made an entire section of Chicago lower its voice. All she knew was that, for the first time in a very long while, a stranger had cleaned his plate and praised her food in the voice of someone telling the truth. The following Wednesday, he returned, sat at the same table, ordered the day's special, finished every bite, paid, thanked her, and left. The Wednesday after that, he did the same. Then the following week, he didn't linger in conversation, didn't ask personal questions, and didn't look at her longer than courtesy allowed. And for a woman who had grown accustomed to every good thing arriving with a price attached, that steady presence, demanding nothing in return, slowly became something that felt almost like safety. By the 5th week, she began speaking to him first. At first, it was only about the weather and the price of vegetables. Later, she told him about the regular customers, the retired printer who always ordered extra soup, and the 2 elderly sisters who argued every week over which one would pay the bill. Cole listened more than he spoke, occasionally asking one brief question at exactly the right moment, and Marin Whitlock, without realizing when it began, started telling the Wednesday man about her life, one piece at a time, cautiously, like someone serving courses to a stranger, deciding which dish should come first, which should be saved for later, and which would never be brought to the table. Once, he asked where she had learned to cook with the instincts of someone who had spent years in a professional kitchen. She wiped the counter, gave a faint smile, and said she had grown up beneath many roofs, though none of them had ever belonged to her. Everywhere she went, someone needed a child who knew how to cook. So she learned. She said it lightly, as though speaking of rain or sunshine, then immediately changed the subject. Cole didn't ask anything more, because he understood better than most that there were doors people opened only wide enough to let someone know they existed, not to invite them inside. Another time, he noticed a small framed photograph on the shelf behind the counter, turned face down against the wall, and one quiet Wednesday afternoon, when the rain kept him there longer than usual over a cup of coffee, she told him about it without being asked. She had once been married to a welder named Danny, a gentleman who wasn't good with words but was gifted with his hands. They had met when he came to repair the fire escape at the old diner where she used to work. They had been married for 3 years when, one morning, someone from the construction site called her. The scaffolding was on the 11th floor. People said many words to her that day, but the only one she remembered was fell. She had been 25. She told the story in an even voice, her eyes fixed on the rain beyond the window, both hands wrapped around her cup of tea, and Cole sat silently, refusing to place empty words of sympathy inside that silence, because he knew that condolences arriving 3 years too late only forced a person to hurt again for the sake of good manners. Then she told him the rest, the part she said had truly been the longest. Danny remained in the hospital for 8 days before he died, 8 days in intensive care, and the bill for those 8 days, together with the surgery, came to a figure she had read over and over, because she thought someone must have printed it incorrectly. She had signed the medical loan documents jointly with her husband, so when he died, the debt remained with her. It was legal and couldn't be disputed. People told her she could declare bankruptcy, escape most of it, and that anyone in her position would do the same. She didn't. Danny had lived his whole life without owing anyone so much as the price of a drink, she said, and she wouldn't let his name die carrying a debt that had been abandoned. So for the past 3 years, she had made a payment every month. Some months she paid the full amount. Some months she could manage only half, and forced herself to make up the difference the next month. Every payment, every dollar, every date, and every receipt was carefully recorded in a blue-covered notebook kept in the drawer beneath the register. When she finished speaking, the only sound left in the diner was the rain. Cole looked at the woman before him, a woman from whom life had taken almost everything, yet who still insisted on repaying a dead man's debt simply to keep his name clean, and something inside his chest, something that had frozen solid on the night he stood in that bedroom doorway, stirred for the first time. He said nothing that day. He only knew, when he stepped out of the diner and into the rain, that he would return the following Wednesday, and that for the first time in a very long while, his week contained a day he looked forward to. Restoring a century-old building properly wasn't something that could be entrusted to an ordinary construction crew. And when Cole asked throughout Chicago's building trade who was best with historic structures, every answer led him to the same name, Walt Hagen. People said the 65-year-old man was so demanding that he had once walked away from a major contract because the developer wanted to replace the original wooden doors with aluminum ones made to look like wood. Walt had said he would rather go home and build small cabinets than put his name on a lie. They also said he was preparing to retire for good and wasn't taking any more work. Cole went looking for him anyway, following the address he had been given to a small rented workshop on the edge of Pilsen, where the silver-haired man was planing an old door amid the smells of wood and linseed oil. Walt listened as Cole described the building in Bridgeport. He said nothing, wiped his hands, asked for the address, then called 3 days later with one blunt sentence. "I'll take it. We start Monday." Then he hung up. Cole didn't know that the unusually quick answer had nothing to do with the building. It came from the name printed on his business card. From the first day, Walt Hagen worked with a manner as cold as steel left outside in the frost, completely professional and completely distant. He spoke only when the work required it, never held a handshake longer than a second, refused every offer of coffee, and watched Cole with the eyes of a man grating something without revealing the scale. But Cole had spent his life among people who concealed what they were thinking, so he didn't ask. He simply worked. And the work began speaking for him. During the first week, the old man realized that this developer wasn't like any developer he had ever met. Cole could read technical drawings, truly read them. He noticed where a load-bearing beam had been omitted from the old plans, and asked questions that only someone who understood construction would know to ask. When a supplier offered new bricks for half the price of properly restored historic ones, Cole refused without a moment's hesitation, and said the building had already been mistreated long enough. What made Walt stand at a distance and watch longest of all was seeing the developer. Instead of standing around giving orders, roll up his own sleeves, climb the scaffolding, and remove every sound brick from the facade himself with a chisel and rubber mallet. He tapped each one gently, listened, eased it free, brushed it clean, and arranged it on the shelves in order so it could later be returned to its original place, with the patience of someone removing stitches from a wound. One afternoon near the end of the month, after all the workers had gone home, Walt came to stand beside Cole near the newly stacked bricks. Without an introduction or any attempt to soften what he was about to say, the old man spoke in a flat voice, as though reading a written statement. 30 years ago, I had a woodworking shop on Halsted Street. My father left it to me. 12 men worked there. It died because of the protection money I had to pay every month to a man named Patrick Callahan. I paid until there was nothing left to pay, and then I closed the doors. My 12 workers lost their jobs, and I've worked for other people ever since. I didn't take this project because of your money. I took it because I wanted to see with my own eyes what kind of man that man's son had become. When he finished, Walt didn't wait for a response. He picked up his toolbox and walked away, leaving Cole alone in the fading afternoon light of the construction site, with his father's name lying between them like a body newly dug from the earth. Cole slept little that night, but the next morning, he arrived at the site on time as always, and he did neither of the two things an ordinary man might have done. He didn't defend his father, because some debts couldn't be explained away, and he didn't dismiss the old man, because driving away someone who spoke the truth would only prove that he couldn't bear to hear it. He chose the only answer he knew was honest. He answered with his work. Through the months that followed, the two men labored beside each other in a strange silence. The old man never formally taught him. He simply did the work where Cole could see. The developer never formally studied under him. He watched and repeated each movement until he got it right. Between them, the building slowly rose like a conversation neither man needed to speak aloud. Cole learned how to read the grain of wood before cutting it. He learned why old lime mortar had to be mixed differently from cement mortar. He learned how to strike a wall with a hammer and tell from the sound whether it was solid or hollow inside. Walt, meanwhile, quietly began noticing things he had never intended to notice. The Callahan son paid every worker on the promised day, without withholding a single dollar. He remembered the name of every assistant on the crew. When he discovered that the electricians had run careless wiring behind a wall, he didn't shout. He ordered it removed and redone, then stood there until the work was finished. And not once, no matter how far the schedule slipped or how low the money ran, did he agree to trade quality for speed. Then, one afternoon at the beginning of winter, the two men stood before the main structural frame, finally straightened after weeks of work. Walt looked over the building from the foundation to the roof, then turned to Cole and spoke the longest sentence he had offered since the project began. I've done this work for 40 years, and I've met more wealthy men than I can count. Most men with money want to build something that looks good in a photograph. But you're thinking about whether this building will still be standing 100 years from now. That's something entirely different. And believe me, a man only understands structure that way after he has watched something of his own collapse. Cole stood still. In a single sentence, the old carpenter had touched the place no one had seen in 15 years, and Cole understood that this was Walt Hagen's way of announcing the final result of his judgment. He didn't thank him, because gratitude would have spoiled the moment. Instead, he opened the leather notebook he still carried with him, turned to the floor plan for the second story, and pointed to the large space near the corner of the street, whose purpose he had not yet decided. He told the old man, I want the final part of this building to be a woodworking shop, restored exactly as your old shop on Halsted Street once stood. Do you still remember what it looked like? Because I need someone to draw it again, right down to the placement of every saw table. Walt Hagen looked at him for a very long time, longer than all his previous moments of judgment combined, and in the old craftsman's eyes, something that had been frozen for 30 years began to crack. The debt wasn't Cole's, and both men knew it, but they also understood what had just happened. Some debts of honor couldn't be repaid with money. They could only be repaid by rebuilding exactly what had once been torn down. Winter moved slowly and coldly through the Bridgeport construction site, but every Wednesday, no matter the snow or the work waiting for him, Cole still went downstairs to the diner, and at some point no one could quite identify. The table beside the window became his table. No one had to say anything. The regular customers simply stopped sitting there. What grew between him and Marin didn't arrive through declarations of love or bouquets of flowers. It came through things so small that anyone hearing about them might have asked, "Is that all?" It came the day Cole noticed that the hinge on the diner door squeaked every time a customer entered, and the following Wednesday, he came downstairs an hour early with a bottle of machine oil in his coat pocket and repaired it before opening time without telling anyone. It came the day Marin noticed that the man always preferred his food less heavily seasoned than the other customers did, and from then on, his plate was prepared separately, without anyone being told. It came during late afternoons after the construction crew had gone home, when Cole stopped by for the final cup of coffee of the day, and the two of them talked about things that seemed to lead nowhere. The retired printer had started ordering a new dish. The final shipment of restored bricks had arrived in full. Onions were more expensive that season, and both of them slowly realized they were telling each other things they had no one else to tell. Marin gradually learned that her Wednesday man was the new owner of the entire building, that he was rebuilding it with his own hands, and once, when she asked how a man who could buy an entire building always managed to have mortar dust on his clothes, Cole was silent for a moment, before saying that he had once possessed far more than this, and had lost almost all of it, partly because it had been taken from him, and partly because he had chosen to leave it behind. It was a long story, he said, and one day he would tell her. Marin nodded and didn't ask for more, because she had long stories of her own and understood the value of not being pushed to tell them. And so they continued, two people carrying wounds that hadn't yet healed, moving toward each other in the small, careful steps of those who had fallen hard enough to be afraid of running. At the beginning of spring, when the roof work was finished, and the first sections of scaffolding had been taken down, Cole invited Marin upstairs to see the rooftop, where he had just restored the old balcony overlooking the city skyline. The diner was quiet that late afternoon, so she hung a sign on the door saying it would be closed for 30 minutes, then followed him up the new wooden stairs, which still carried the scent of oil. From the balcony, Chicago spread out before them beneath the first lights of evening. In the distance, the towers of downtown shone brightly, and closer by were the low rooftops of Bridgeport. Marin stood there for a long time, with one hand resting on the freshly painted iron railing, so silent that when Cole turned toward her, he saw that her eyes were red. She wasn't crying. She was only standing very close to the edge of tears, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet, but every word was clear. You know, that diner downstairs is the first thing in my life that has ever belonged to me. Before it, I never had anything people couldn't take away. And now, standing here, seeing the city look this beautiful, with you beside me like this, I have to admit something terrible. I've become so accustomed to loss that when something good comes into my life, my first instinct isn't to feel happy. It's to calculate how I'll lose it, when I'll lose it, and why. When she finished, she lowered her eyes, as though ashamed to have revealed that wounded and distorted part of herself. Cole didn't answer immediately. He looked out at the city for a while, the city that had taken so much from him and was now returning something to him slowly, one brick at a time. Then he turned toward her and said in a low, steady voice without the slightest trace of ornament, "Then this time, don't calculate, just breathe." He spoke the final two words slowly, one at a time. Just breathe. Marin lifted her eyes to him, looking at the man who was as full of cracks as the building he was repairing, and for the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to do exactly that. She didn't calculate. She only breathed. And within that breath, her hand moved slightly along the railing until it touched his, and he didn't pull away. They stood that way until every streetlight below had come on, and neither of them said another word. Because there are moments that can only be ruined by saying more. The diner's 30-minute closure lasted an hour that day, and when they returned to the ground floor, 2 regular customers were waiting outside the door, smiling knowingly at them, and Marin blushed for the first time in many years. The weeks that followed were the weeks both of them would later remember as the most peaceful period of their lives. There were late dinners after the diner closed, Sunday mornings when Marin brought coffee up to the construction site, the sound of her laughter mingling with the whine of Walt's saw, and small plans spoken aloud, that when the building was finished, the diner would be expanded, a new kitchen would be installed, more tables would be added, and Walt would rebuild the wooden sign with his own hands. For those two people, happiness wasn't fireworks. It was daring to make plans for the future, something neither of them had allowed themselves to do for years. And at the exact moment they began to dare, life came knocking in the way it had always knocked for people like them. Early one Monday morning at the beginning of summer, Marin arrived at the diner as she always did, and from the far end of the street, she could already see that something was different. A white sheet of paper had been neatly taped to the glass door, secured at all four corners, straight and professional, carrying the particular neatness of bad news delivered by an office. She stood in front of her diner and read every line, feeling the familiar ground beneath her feet tilt slightly. The notice came from a debt collection company whose name she had never heard before. It declared that the company had purchased her entire medical debt from the previous creditor, cited a clause in the original agreement allowing the holder of the debt to demand early repayment in full, and gave her a final deadline of 60 days. She could either pay the entire remaining balance, or they would begin proceedings to seize her property, and the only property in the world held in the name of Maren Whitlock was the small diner behind her. She had made every payment for 3 years without missing a single one, and they had still found a way. She stood there for a very long time, holding the key to the diner without opening the door, and upstairs, through a newly restored arched window, Cole looked down and saw the woman he loved standing motionless before a white sheet of paper. With the instinct of a man who had spent 15 years living among bad news, he knew that their season of peace had just ended. That afternoon, Cole sat with Maren in the diner after closing time. The notice spread across the table between them, and he read it 3 times with the lifelong habit of a man accustomed to studying contracts. The more he read, the more certain he became that something was wrong. Not legally wrong, but wrong according to the logic of people who made money from debt. A medical debt that had been paid consistently for 3 years was exactly the kind of debt no collection company would normally want to touch, because there was little profit in buying it. The debtor was already making regular payments, so what reason was there to force the issue? And the early repayment clause was indeed present in the original agreement, but it was the kind of dormant clause that only someone reading every line with a very specific purpose would think to uncover. No one purchased a healthy, performing debt only to demand full payment within 60 days, unless what they wanted wasn't the money, but the property that could be seized when the debtor failed to pay. And Maren's only asset was this diner, located on the ground floor of his building. Cole looked around the room once, and the old instinct that had kept him alive for 15 years began sounding its familiar low warning inside his chest. He told Maren to let him look into it, not to sign anything, and not to call any number printed on the notice. That same evening, he contacted his private attorney, the only person remaining from his former life whom he still trusted, and gave him one instruction: tear this collection company apart, all the way to its roots. I want to know who is behind it. The attorney needed 10 days. During those 10 days, life on the surface continued as before. Walt's saws still echoed through the construction site. The diner remained open, and Maren continued cooking, but both of them knew they were living inside a period of waiting. And Maren, the woman who had become accustomed to calculating how every good thing would be taken from her, stayed late every night with her blue-covered notebook, adding and adding the numbers that could never be made to reach the amount she needed. Then, on Friday evening, the attorney called, and he began with a sentence Cole had heard once before in his life, on the day he discovered the truth about the house, intended as a wedding gift. Mr. Callahan, you should sit down before you hear this. The collection company was a shell corporation registered through 2 layers of intermediaries in 2 different states, and when both layers were stripped away, the name at the very bottom, the name of the true beneficiary, was Brendan Callahan. Cole stood beside the apartment window with the phone in his hand, and for one brief moment, he felt nothing at all. No anger, no shock, only the cold, still sensation of a man hearing confirmation of something his bones had already understood before his mind had been ready to understand it. Then the attorney told him the rest. The part he said was truly frightening, because it revealed the entire picture when everyone had previously seen only one corner of it. It had begun even before the betrayal. More than 2 years earlier, Brendan, acting as the attorney responsible for managing client trust accounts, had quietly begun withdrawing money from those accounts, money the law treated as untouchable as flame near gasoline, and pouring it into a private scheme of his own. He purchased distressed debts in neighborhoods scheduled for redevelopment, waited for property values to rise, seized the assets, and sold them for profit. The scheme required enormous amounts of capital and moved slowly, and eventually, the hole Brendan had dug in the trust accounts became so deep that no profit could fill it before the state bar auditors arrived. He needed a vast amount of clean money, and he needed it quickly. At precisely that moment, the older brother who had carried his burdens all his life placed a perfect opportunity directly into his hands, an enormous body of assets being converted into legitimate holdings. With every document passing across Brendan's desk, and a brother who trusted his own blood enough to sign without reading. So 8 months before that fateful night, Brendan began inserting his control into every layer of the structure. The affair with Whitney, however it had started, became a useful part of the plan, because a brother shattered by betrayal would walk away, and a man who walked away wouldn't remain behind to examine the paperwork. But Brendan's plan encountered something he hadn't anticipated. The assets he had seized were locked inside corporate structures, and withdrawing a large amount of money too quickly would leave a trail visible to any auditor, no different from lighting a lamp that pointed directly back to the hole in the client trust accounts. He was sitting on a mountain of assets he didn't dare spend, while the missing money remained missing. The audit drew closer, and the distressed debt scheme still had to continue if he hoped to recover his losses. The attorney sent over a list of debts held by the shell company, and Cole searched every line on the screen, unfamiliar names and addresses scattered through neighborhoods scheduled for redevelopment, until his eyes stopped near the bottom of the list. Whitlock, Marin, followed by the address of the ground floor of his Bridgeport building, and the internal note beside her name, which the attorney had managed to uncover, said nothing about money. It stated simply, priority for early action, asset located within target property. Target property. Cole read those words and understood the final layer of the truth. Brendan had known where he was for a long time. He knew Cole was rebuilding his life around an old building in Bridgeport. He even knew what the woman on the ground floor of that building meant to him, and Marin's debt, on his brother's chessboard, was an arrow aimed at 2 targets. It would seize an asset on land rising in value, while also tearing out the first root the brother he had stripped of everything was trying to put down as he rebuilt his life. Cole turned off the screen and sat for a long time in the darkness of the apartment, thinking about Marin, about the woman who had spent 3 years repaying her dead husband's debt, simply to keep his name clean, and who was now being used as a piece in a game she didn't even know she had been placed into, only because she had happened to cook good food on the ground floor of a building, and had happened to be loved by a man named Callahan. The past Cole believed he had left behind had never truly released him. It had only changed direction, moved around him, and was now slowly tightening its hands around the throat of the woman he loved. That night, after turning off the screen, Cole sat in the darkness and faced the truth that he had 2 paths before him, and he knew them both, as well as he knew the palms of his own hands. The first was the old path, the road whose every stone had already been worn smooth for him by 15 years as a boss. He still had his name. He still had people throughout the South Side who owed him favors, and in his old world, a shell company with a handful of hired debt collectors was nothing more than a mosquito. One meeting, one message delivered to the right person, one name spoken in the right room, and the notice on Marin's diner door would disappear as though it had never existed. Whoever had posted it would remove it with his own hands and apologize. Fast, certain, and clean, according to the meaning of cleanliness in that world. The second path was the new one, the path of documents and courtrooms, slow as a grinding stone, expensive, and with no one willing to promise the outcome, because Brendan's scheme had been built by a skilled lawyer who knew perfectly well that he was breaking the law, and had therefore hidden each crime more carefully than the last. Taking that path meant racing against a 60-day deadline with his legs bound, and if they lost, Marin's diner would be seized before any judge had time to finish reading the file. The following morning, Sal DeMarco came to the construction site. Cole had called him, not to ask for help, but because throughout his life, he had always needed to speak every important decision aloud once in front of this man, as though hearing his own voice made the choice real. The 2 of them stood on the second floor amid the smell of new wood and lime mortar, and Cole told him everything, about the shell company, the client trust accounts, and the note describing the property as a target. Sal listened without interrupting, his eyes narrowing with every detail, and when Cole finished, the old man asked only one question. "How do you want me to handle it?" Then, without waiting for an answer, he added in the calm voice of someone who had spent his life doing such things, "My way, it's finished in one evening. Tomorrow morning, the girl opens her diner as usual, and no one will dare come near Bridgeport again. All you have to do is nod." Cole stood there looking at the most loyal man he had ever known, feeling the comforting weight of that offer, the way it promised to solve everything with nothing more than a nod, and he understood that this was the moment that would shape the rest of his life, because that nod wasn't free. To nod would be to admit that Whitney had been right after all, that beneath every layer of gold, he was still the same old thing, that the only road he knew how to take when cornered was the one leading back into the mud, and that every brick he had removed, cleaned, and carefully returned to its place over the past months, had been nothing more than decoration. To nod would mean that the woman downstairs would be saved by a boss, not allowed to stand beside a decent man. Cole looked at Sal for a long time, then slowly and firmly shook his head. No, not this time. I'm taking the straight road, the road of the law. I need you to do only one thing. Keep an eye on the diner. Don't let anyone frighten her. Leave the rest to me. Sal studied his former leader for a long while, and something passed through the old man's eyes that looked like regret and admiration at once. Then he nodded. All right, your way. He never mentioned the offer again. From that day forward, life on the Bridgeport corner moved to the rhythm of two parallel countdowns. One was visible on the calendar hanging behind the diner counter, where Marin crossed out each day leading toward the 60-day deadline. The other unfolded quietly inside the envelopes and files growing thicker each week in the lawyer's office, where every corporate layer was stripped away, every piece of evidence notarized, and every petition prepared for submission to the court and the state bar. Cole lived between those two rhythms. During the day, he worked beside Walt at the construction site to keep his hands occupied. In the afternoon, he sat with the lawyer to keep his mind occupied. At night, he went downstairs for a late meal with Marin and refused to let even the smallest trace of worry show on his face, because she already had enough to carry. He told her only part of the truth, that he had hired a good lawyer, that there were legal problems with the debt, and that they were fighting it through the law. She nodded and trusted him, and that simple trust weighed more heavily on his shoulders than any debt he had ever carried. Then, during the 5th week, the other side lost patience. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, when the diner was nearly empty, 2 men in cheap suits pushed through the door. They ordered nothing, drank nothing, and stood in the middle of the room speaking loudly to Marin. They said they had come to make a preliminary inventory of the property that would be seized, that she should cooperate now if she wanted to avoid unnecessary trouble, and one of them casually lifted a wooden chair to inspect it, as though it already belonged to him. Marin stood behind the counter, her face turning white, but her back remained straight. Before she could answer, the diner door opened again. Cole stepped inside, still wearing the clothes dusted with mortar from the construction site. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten them. He simply crossed the room with slow steps, stopped between the 2 men and the register, then looked directly at the man holding the chair. No one who witnessed what happened that day could later repeat exactly what Cole said, because he spoke so softly that only the man in front of him could hear. But everyone saw the result. The man lowered the chair so gently that it made no sound and stepped back. The other man opened his mouth to speak, but Sal, who had somehow appeared in the doorway without anyone noticing, stepped inside, placed one hand on his shoulder, and guided him out as smoothly as someone escorting a guest from the premises. The 2 men climbed into their car and drove away without looking back. Cole turned toward Marin, and for 1 second, she saw something in her Wednesday man that she had never seen before. A stillness with weight, the kind of stillness that forced an entire room to rearrange itself around him. And without anyone explaining, she understood what kind of truth lay behind his words about once having possessed far more than this. But what made her heart tighten wasn't fear. It was the opposite, because the next moment, Cole relaxed his shoulders, picked up the cloth from the counter, wiped the surface of the chair the man had touched, and asked in the same voice he used on every ordinary evening, "Is there any soup left? I haven't eaten since noon." That man was still frightening, she thought, perhaps more frightening than any of the rumors she had heard in passing. But he was frightening in the way he chose to be, and he had chosen to stand between her and everything ugly that had come through that door, with mortar dust on the back of his shirt instead of the darkness of his former life. The first person to sense that a net was closing wasn't one of the hired debt collectors, but the man weaving the net from the other side. Brendan was a skilled lawyer, and a skilled lawyer recognized immediately when someone began pulling at the threads around him. Requests for corporate registration records in 2 different states, filed by the same law office. Inquiries sent to an old notary's office. Small movements that were lawful and quiet, yet to a guilty man, each one sounded like footsteps in the hallway at midnight. He didn't know exactly how much Cole had uncovered, but he knew who was pulling the threads, and he did what men like him always did when they smelled danger. He didn't call his brother. He pushed someone else forward to make the call for him. One Thursday evening, Cole's phone lit up with a number that wasn't saved but that he knew by heart, the landline at the house on the west side, the house he had purchased. He watched the screen through 3 rings, and within those 3 rings, An entire year of silence passed before his eyes. A year without a single call asking whether he was alive or dead, without one holiday message, a year in which the eldest son's disappearance from that family had been accepted so quietly that it was almost as though he had never existed, and the only thing anyone noticed was that the money had stopped coming. He answered on the fourth ring. Eileen's voice came through, and the first thing that hurt wasn't what she said, but the fact that her voice sounded exactly the same, carrying the same familiar softness touched with reproach, as though they had spoken only the week before, as though an entire year didn't stand between them. She asked how he had been, but only for form's sake, without waiting for a complete answer. And then she came to the reason for the call, wrapped in the same language Cole had heard all his life. His brother was in trouble. She didn't understand all of it, something about legal documents and regulations, but she had heard that someone was trying to hurt him, digging into his work. Cole knew how important Brendan's career was. The entire family depended on him. Cole was the eldest brother, and he knew people everywhere. He should step in and help his brother this once. Family matters should be settled behind closed doors. He shouldn't let outsiders turn it into something larger. Cole stood beside the apartment window, listening to every word, and he almost smiled at the completeness of the performance. Someone was trying to hurt him. Outsiders? His mother didn't know, or had chosen not to know, that the person doing the digging was the very son she was calling for help, and that what was being uncovered wasn't some conspiracy to destroy Brendan, but the truth about what her younger son had done to his own brother. Brendan had pushed their mother forward as a shield, knowing that Cole had never once in his life said no to this woman, and more than any report from the attorney, this call was the clearest sign that Cole's circle was tightening in exactly the right place. The animal had smelled smoke and had begun reaching for desperate moves. Cole let his mother finish without interrupting once, because he wanted to hear whether, anywhere in all those words, there was even one sentence, one word, meant for him, for what he had lost, for the year he had been gone, for the reason he had disappeared. A reason she had surely heard from the other side in one version or another. There wasn't. From beginning to end, the call contained only one person who needed saving, and that person wasn't Cole. It had never been Cole. When she finished, silence stretched across the line, and Cole finally spoke. His voice wasn't cold or sharp. It was low and slow, the voice of a man saying something he had considered carefully for a very long time, and had only been waiting for the chance to speak aloud. "Mother, I'm not going to ask whether you know what your son did to me, because either answer would hurt the same. I only want you to hear one thing clearly, just this once. I'm still your son. That hasn't changed. It doesn't change today, and it won't change later. But I'm no longer this family's shield. For 15 years, whenever anyone needed something, they called me. When someone fell into debt, I carried it. When someone got into trouble, I stepped in. And not one person in this family ever asked me whether I was all right. Now your son is in trouble, Mother, and that trouble was created by his own hands, through what he did to other people and to his own brother. And for the first time in his life, no one will stand between him and the consequences. I'm not going to hurt him, so don't be afraid. I'm simply not going to rescue him anymore. There is a difference, Mother." The other end of the line went completely silent, and then Eileen began to cry. Real tears, not a weapon, the broken sobs of a woman whose familiar world had just split open along a deep crack, and through those sobs came fragments of words. "How could you? We're family. I'm an old woman now." Cole stood still, looking out at the rooftops of Bridgeport as their lights came on, and he did something more difficult than anything else he had ever done in his life. He didn't take back a single word, and he didn't hang up. He let his mother cry until there were no tears left, remaining there as her son, but no longer kneeling. When her crying finally eased, he said, "Take care of yourself, Mother. The weather is turning cold. Make sure someone checks the furnace before winter." He didn't say it merely to be polite. He meant it with all the love that still remained untouched inside him, except that from now on, that love would be given from a distance he had chosen in order to survive. He said goodbye, waited until she answered with a very quiet, "All right," and only then ended the call. The apartment was dark and still. Cole remained by the window for a long time without turning on the light. The call had hurt, but it had also given him the final answer he needed. The other side was frightened. Brendan had used his last card, which meant the time was right. The following morning, Cole went to his attorney's office and listened as they reviewed the entire file, one final time. Every certified record, every notarized signature, every page of evidence concerning the shell company, and the suspicious transactions surrounding it. When the attorney asked whether he was certain, because once the complaint was filed, it couldn't be withdrawn, and the man who would be investigated was his own brother, Cole signed his name on the final page with the same slow, steady hand he had used on the day he purchased the building, then said, "File it." That afternoon, the documents left the attorney's office inside a sealed envelope, crossed the city, and were received at the state bar's office, where they were stamped with a date and assigned a case number as quietly as every other file processed that day. No one in that room knew that the envelope settling into the tray had begun counting down the final days of a man on the other side of the city who still believed he had calculated every possible move. Only 2 squares remained uncrossed on the calendar behind the diner counter. On the morning of day 58, Cole's attorney called with the news they had both awaited and feared for weeks. The court had agreed to hold an emergency hearing the following afternoon, which meant fewer than 48 hours remained before the seizure order took effect. And everything, the diner, 3 years of one woman's sweat, and one man's silent promise, would be decided inside a small courtroom in less than a single afternoon. The night before the hearing, the diner closed early, and 3 people sat around the table beside the window: Cole, Marin, and the attorney with his thick leather briefcase, reviewing every step for the following day. Their strategy didn't challenge whether the debt was real, because it was. Instead, it attacked something else, what the attorney called the small crack that could bring down the entire wall: the numbers. And that was where Marin's blue-covered notebook came out of the drawer beneath the register to do something no one, including Marin herself, had ever imagined it would do. For 3 years, she had recorded everything in the careful handwriting of someone taught that attention to detail was the only way to keep life from finding fault with her. The date of each payment, the amount, the receipt number, the name of the employee who collected it, even the months when she could pay only half and made up the difference the following month. Everything was there, without a single missing line. The attorney had taken that notebook and compared it with the balance statement the collection company had submitted with its petition to seize the diner, performing the additions and subtractions no one should have needed to perform in a decent world. And the result made even him, a man with 30 years in the profession, remove his glasses and wipe them. The numbers didn't match. They weren't even close. According to the company's statement, Marin still owed considerably more than her notebook and stack of receipts proved she should, which meant that somewhere along the way, her payments had been underreported, recorded incorrectly, or made to disappear, and the balance had been inflated just enough to make her property eligible for seizure under the early repayment clause. They hadn't merely purchased her debt to steal the diner. They had altered the numbers so the theft would look like justice. On the afternoon of day 59, the small courtroom glowed beneath fluorescent lights. Marin sat at the claimant's table beside the attorney, her hands clasped tightly together on the tabletop, wearing the finest clothes she owned, while Cole sat in the public gallery behind her, close enough for her to know he was there, yet far enough away for the hearing to belong to her. On the other side, the collection company's attorney spoke smoothly about the contract, the clause, and the rights of the debt holder, every word polished until it gleamed with legality. Then it was their turn, and Marin's attorney didn't say much. He merely asked the court's permission to present 2 pieces of evidence. The first was the company's balance statement. The second was a worn blue-covered notebook accompanied by a stack of receipts numbered by year. He then requested that the court compare the 12 most recent payment periods publicly, one by one. With every calculation, the courtroom grew quieter. By the 7th payment, the judge had begun taking notes of her own. By the 10th, she interrupted and asked the company's attorney directly how he explained the discrepancy. For the first time that afternoon, the man on the other side lost his smooth composure and requested time to consult with his client. The judge studied him over the rims of her glasses, then looked down at the open notebook before her, at the careful columns written by a woman who cooked for a living and had spent 3 years keeping a promise to a dead man. When she issued her ruling, her voice was brief and dry, like the strike of a gavel. The seizure order was suspended indefinitely until the discrepancy in the balance could be fully investigated. The court also ordered the company to produce all accounting records connected to this debt and to similar debts, so they could be examined for evidence of systematic fraud. The second sentence was the important one, and only 2 people in the courtroom understood its full weight: Cole and his attorney, because that order to produce the company's books was the door they had been aiming for from the beginning. Once the shell company's records were opened beneath the light of the court, The money moving through them would have nowhere left to hide, and that money, as the file already sitting with the State Bar had shown, flowed directly toward the black hole inside the client trust accounts of a prominent law firm in the center of the city. Marin knew nothing of that deeper layer. All she knew, when she stepped out of the courthouse into the slanting sunlight of late afternoon, was that the diner was still hers, that she could still wake before dawn the next morning and light the stove, and she stood on the courthouse steps and cried, freely and completely like a child, in front of the uncomfortable attorney and the man who waited in silence until she had finished. That evening, while signing the documents that concluded the first stage of the case with the attorney at the diner, Marin saw the page listing the legal fees. She stopped at the amount, then at the note beneath it. All costs paid in full. She asked who had paid them. The attorney looked toward Cole, and Cole met his eyes with a look that told him to speak honestly. And so everything came out, not only the fees for the hearing, but the cost of investigating the shell company from the very beginning, obtaining corporate records from 2 states, notarizing documents, everything. Her Wednesday man had been quietly standing behind it all before she had even found time to worry about how it would be paid. After the attorney left, only the 2 of them remained in the diner, beneath the warm yellow lights. Marin stood behind the counter, with both hands resting on the wooden surface, and looked at Cole for a long time. Then she asked, her voice neither angry nor accusing, only plain and direct like the woman herself. "Why? You've paid so much for me without saying a word. Why?" Cole sat at the table beside the window, the table that had belonged to him for nearly a year, slowly turning a cup of cold coffee between his hands. He was silent for a long time, then raised his eyes to hers and spoke slowly and clearly, placing each word on the table between them. "Because I've spent my entire life paying the debts of people who weren't grateful. Just once, I wanted to erase a debt for someone who deserved it." The little diner fell completely silent, except for the steady ticking of the old clock behind the counter, and Marin stood there, a woman who had never once in her life been chosen first, feeling those words sink into her chest one layer at a time. Then she came around the counter, sat in the chair across from him, placed her hand over his, and this time, he wasn't the one who took her hand. She took his, holding it tightly the way someone holds on to something she has decided she will never allow herself to lose. Karma has a habit that even the cleverest people forget while they are winning. It doesn't arrive with a warning. It doesn't knock on the door, doesn't send advance notice, and doesn't give anyone time to prepare. It simply appears on an ordinary day. And when it does, it takes the exact shape of the choices a person made with his own hands. For Brendan Callahan, karma took the form of a court order demanding the production of financial records, the kind of dry legal document he himself had drafted countless times for other people throughout his career. The chain of collapse moved so quickly that lawyers in Chicago would later tell the story as though describing a building whose foundation had been removed. It stood unchanged for years, then fell within a matter of weeks. The shell company's records were submitted to the court as ordered. Appointed auditors began their work, and those diligent people did the one thing Brendan feared most in the world. They followed the money. Where had the funds used to purchase the distressed debts come from? The answer led through 2 layers of intermediaries, through holding accounts, until it finally reached a source no auditor could overlook, the client trust accounts of a law firm. At that exact moment, the file Cole had previously submitted was already waiting at the State Bar like a map drawn in advance for the investigators. The 2 independent bodies of evidence matched line for line, and the final door swung open. The greatest irony, the detail that made even the investigators shake their heads when they summarized the case, was that the evidence most damaging to Brendan wasn't his theft of his brother's assets, because that had been carefully concealed beneath airtight legal documents. It was his own frantic efforts during the final months to repair the hole in the trust accounts. The closer the audit came, the more reckless he became, moving money through one channel after another to cover one shortage with another, and every movement left a new set of footprints in the snow, clearer, fresher, and easier to follow. Greed had dug the hole, and panic had built the indictment while trying to fill it. The bad news reached Brendan in the cold, orderly sequence of the system. One morning brought a notice from the State Bar temporarily suspending his license to practice law, and the Georgetown degree hanging on his office wall suddenly became nothing more than an expensive decoration. A few days later came an order freezing his accounts and every corporate structure under his name, including the assets he had taken from his brother. Everything was locked beneath the seal of the court, and no one could withdraw a single dollar. By the end of the month, the neighbors in the wealthy community where he lived saw a for sale sign planted on the lawn of his large house, a sign Brendan and his wife hadn't placed there. The bank had. Clients left in groups. Colleagues who had once raised glasses with him at elegant parties no longer answered his calls. And Brendan Callahan, 31 years old, learned from life what no law school had taught him. The system he believed he was clever enough to stand above had merely not looked in his direction yet, and when it finally did, it didn't blink. One late afternoon at the beginning of autumn, he came to Bridgeport. Cole was on the second floor of the building with Walt, aligning the final window frames in the woodworking shop that was taking shape, when one of the workers came upstairs to say someone was asking for him. When Cole went down, Brendan was standing there in the middle of the construction site, out of place in an expensive suit that was now slightly wrinkled, wearing the face of a man who hadn't slept for many nights. Nothing remained of the man who had once leaned back in his chair at the family dinner table and declared that Cole should be thanking him. Brendan spoke quickly and said too much, the words piling over one another. "Cole, everything is falling apart. They're going to take my license permanently. They're talking about criminal charges, about prison. You have the file. You have a good lawyer. You know people. You only have to withdraw the complaint. Just tell them the family has settled everything privately. You want the assets back? I'll return them. All of them. I can sign everything right now. Just save me this once. We're brothers." That final sentence, "we're brothers," fell between them in the middle of the construction site and lay there like a counterfeit coin. Cole stood still and listened from beginning to end, without interrupting once. The carpenter's measuring rule still in his hand, and mortar dust on the shoulders of his shirt. The workers nearby quietly moved farther away. Even Walt stepped back into the workshop, leaving the courtyard to the two Callahan brothers. Cole looked at his younger brother, and the strange thing was that he felt no satisfaction, none of the triumph he had imagined during the worst nights of the past year that he might feel when this moment finally came. There was nothing, only an old weariness, and beneath it, deeper down, something close to pity. Not pity for the man standing before him, but for the little boy Cole had once carried to school on rainy days, the boy who had died somewhere along the road to Georgetown without Cole noticing in time. When Brendan finally stopped speaking, breathing heavily and waiting for an answer, Cole spoke. His voice wasn't louder than necessary, and wasn't colder than necessary. Each sentence stood apart from the next, like a brick being placed into position. "I paid for that degree. I paid for it with 15 years of my life. You lost it yourself. Not me, not the court, not the state bar. You. You did it with your own hands. And what I learned during all those years of carrying this family, late, but I learned it, is that there are some debts I can't pay for you. Money debts I can pay. I've spent my whole life paying those. But this debt, the one you owe now, you owe it to the clients whose money you took, to the woman downstairs who nearly lost everything she owned because of your scheme, and to yourself. That debt is yours to pay, and the law will decide the price." Brendan opened his mouth to say something, and Cole gave one slight shake of his head, enough to stop the words before they could be spoken. Then he said the last thing he had to say. "Go home. Don't come here again. There is nothing for you here." Cole turned away, climbed the wooden stairs, and returned to the second floor, where Walt was pretending to be occupied with a window frame. He picked up the measuring rule again, bent down, and continued measuring the threshold where he had left off, his hand steady, the pencil line straight, as though the previous 10 minutes had been nothing more than a gust of wind passing through the construction site. In the courtyard below, Brendan remained for a while among the neatly stacked restored bricks, surrounded by the world his brother was rebuilding from the very ruins Brendan had helped create. Then he left, and the sound of his footsteps across the ground blended into the steady sound of Walt's saw from the workshop. No one turned to watch him go. Whitney Prescott became Whitney Callahan 10 months after that fateful night, in a wedding so strangely small for a woman who had spent her entire life living for crowded rooms. There were 40 guests, a rented garden in the suburbs, and no announcement on social media, because how could anyone celebrate loudly when a ring had been removed from one person's future and placed on another person's hand? She told herself she had chosen correctly, that Brendan was respectable, educated, successful, the kind of man who could enter a ballroom without making anyone lower their eyes, and for nearly 2 years, she lived inside that choice, the way someone lived inside a model home, beautiful, bright, and without a heating system. Whitney wasn't foolish. She had never been foolish. She was simply a gifted strategist who had miscalculated the one equation that mattered most. And she discovered that mistake slowly, through the way Brendan spoke about people the moment they left the room, through the way he needed her to look magnificent when guests were present, but didn't glance at her once after the doors closed, through the way every failure inside their home somehow found a path back to her. And one night during their second year of marriage, lying awake inside the silence of the enormous house, she understood something she would never admit to anyone. Brendan was a man who needed someone beneath him in order to stand tall. Once, that person had been his brother. Now, it was her. Then the storm arrived. The suspension of his license, the frozen accounts, the sale sign on the front lawn, and during the weeks when their home began collapsing around them, Whitney discovered how little she truly knew about her husband. He came home late. Papers remained locked inside his office. Telephone conversations were whispered behind closed doors. Suitcases were brought down from the attic and then hidden away again. And one afternoon, when he forgot to lock his computer, she saw an open inbox on the screen, containing unfinished searches for one-way airline tickets to countries she knew only from movies, all booked for one person, not two. But what turned her blood cold wasn't the tickets. It was the packet of documents he had forgotten beside the printer. A carefully prepared statement, in which, through the clear and polished legal language she had heard him use all his life, the entire movement of the money taken from the trust accounts had been rewritten as his wife's idea. The shell companies were described as companies she had proposed creating, and attached to the statement were copies of page after page bearing her signature, documents he had brought home throughout their 2 years of marriage, and told her to sign because they were only routine paperwork. She had signed while watering plants, signed while speaking on the phone, signed without reading, because why would anyone need to read documents prepared by a lawyer who was also her husband? Whitney stood in her husband's office holding that packet, and understood with icy clarity exactly where she was. He was going to flee alone, and leave her standing in the middle of the fire, with her own signature scattered across every layer of the case, the perfect accomplice wife, prepared as carefully as everything Brendan had ever done. She, the woman who had stepped through another person's engagement to take what she wanted, the woman who had believed life was a chessboard, and that she was always the one moving first, was now standing inside the very trap she had once helped set for someone else. Except this time, the victim wore her face. That night, after Brendan fell asleep, Whitney went into the bathroom, locked the door, and sat on the floor with her back against the cold bathtub and her knees drawn to her chest, a position she hadn't allowed herself to sit in since she was 18. In the silence, broken only by the slow dripping of the faucet, her mind, for the first time after 2 years of running, went directly toward the man she had betrayed. She didn't think of Cole through the shield of excuses she had always built to protect herself, that he was distant, that he was married to his work, that she deserved more. For the first time, she saw him without protection or disguise. The man who had risen before dawn and returned after midnight, throughout all the years she had known him. The man who had never bought himself anything expensive while her ring, her car, and her vacations had never been denied. The man who had silently poured more wine whenever she belittled his background in front of her friends. The man who had intended to give her a house and an entire life made clean, and she had returned all of it with a message whose every word came back to her intact that night on the bathroom floor, like a blade turning inward. That man had carried an entire world in silence, and she had called him mud. Whitney sat there for a long time without crying aloud. Only her shoulders trembled. When she finally stood, washed her face, and looked into the mirror, she saw something she had never seen in any reflection before. Not the most beautiful woman in the ballroom, not a victim, only a 32-year-old woman who had spent every ounce of cleverness she possessed to purchase exactly this. The following morning, she didn't wake her husband. She made coffee, sat at the kitchen table in the house that would soon no longer belong to them, and took from her pocket the business card a state bar investigator had left during a previous visit, the card she had planned to throw away. She stared at it through 3 sips of coffee. She knew exactly what she was about to do and what it would cost. Testifying meant standing beneath the lights. It meant seeing her name in the newspapers beside the word scandal. It meant watching her ballroom friends disappear within a week. It meant losing the reputation she had spent half her life polishing, and in return, she would receive nothing. The lawyers later made that clear. Voluntary testimony guaranteed her no immunity, returned none of her money, saved no marriage, and earned her no gratitude. She dialed the number. The phone rang twice before someone answered, and Whitney Callahan, in the calmest voice she had ever heard from herself, said, "I'm Brendan Callahan's wife. I have information to provide, all of it, and I want to give my statement before my husband reaches the airport." She ended the call, finished the last sip of cold coffee, and realized that her hand wasn't trembling. In 32 years of life, this was the first thing she had ever done that brought her no personal benefit, and it was also the first thing in many years that allowed her to look directly into a mirror. Brendan Callahan never made it to the airport. They came for him that same afternoon, politely and according to procedure, carrying questions for which he no longer had any possible answers, because on the other side of the city, his wife had spent 6 hours inside an office at the state bar, seated before a recording device, and 2 investigators, recounting everything slowly, clearly, and methodically. From the documents he had brought home with the words, "It's only routine paperwork," to the prepared statement left beside the printer, to the one-way tickets booked for a single passenger. Whitney's testimony wasn't the largest piece of the case. The auditors had already reconstructed nearly the entire picture from the financial records, but hers was the living piece, the piece that could speak, the piece that transformed dry columns of numbers into a story with intention, a guiding hand, and a face. More importantly, it destroyed the final defense Brendan had so carefully prepared, because how could he blame a naive wife when that same wife was sitting before the authorities voluntarily, without bargaining for anything in return, revealing even the details that placed her own conduct in an unfavorable light? The trial didn't last as long as the newspapers had predicted. Faced with a mountain of evidence, the defense attorneys turned their attention to negotiating the sentence. And on a winter morning, inside a crowded courtroom, Brendan Callahan stood and listened as the court pronounced judgment. Misappropriation of client trust funds, systematic fraud, obstruction of justice, many years in prison, permanent disbarment, and restitution drawn from all the frozen assets. The property he had taken from his brother was separated from the rest, handled through an independent civil ruling, and returned to its lawful owner. Cole received that decision through his attorney, read it, and merely nodded once. He didn't celebrate, because there are things that return only after a person no longer needs them, in the way he once did. Cole didn't attend the trial. On the day the sentence was announced, he was at the construction site, standing beside Walt on the rooftop, while the workers laid the final row of tiles. When the attorney called with the news, Cole listened to the end, thanked him, slipped the phone into his pocket, and turned back to ask Walt about the slope of the rain gutter. The old man looked at him 1 second longer than usual, then answered his question about the slope of the rain gutter, because both men understood that some judgments required no commentary. The only member of the family who attended every court session was Eileen. She sat in the last row, small and still inside her dark coat, listening to every word, and watching her youngest son stand between 2 attorneys, as though she were looking at someone both familiar and unknown. No one knew what she was thinking, because she didn't cry in court, and didn't answer the reporters. She simply came, sat, listened, and went home. But 1 week after the sentencing, she finally did something she had postponed for months. She found the telephone number for a company called Callahan Restoration, a name she had seen in a local newspaper article about an old building being restored in Bridgeport. The article included a photograph taken from a distance of a man standing on scaffolding, and she recognized him immediately by the shape of his shoulders. She dialed the number one afternoon, her hand trembling more than she had expected, and a young woman answered in a courteous, professional voice. "Callahan Restoration, how may I help you?" Eileen said. "Let me speak to Cole. I'm his mother." There was a very brief pause on the other end. Then the young woman remained polite. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Mr. Callahan isn't in the office at the moment. Would you like to leave a message?" "Mr. Callahan." Eileen stood in the kitchen of the house on the west side with the receiver in her hand, and those 2 words passed through her in a way no accusation ever could. Mr. Callahan, her son, the 19-year-old boy who had washed dishes alone after his father's funeral, the child she had only needed to call whenever the family required something. And the money came, he came, and every problem was solved before she had even found time to worry. The child she had taught from boyhood into manhood that being the eldest meant yielding, carrying the burden, and always being the bigger person. She had truly believed that was the right way to raise him, right up until the dinner when he placed a file in the middle of the table and she chose to tell him to remain silent instead of opening the file and reading it. Now, to hear his voice, she had to go through a receptionist, and he was Mr. Callahan, who wasn't currently in the office. The young woman repeated, "Ma'am, would you like to leave a message?" Eileen remained silent for a long time, then said very softly, "No, no message. Thank you." She lowered the receiver. Then she walked to the armchair beside the window, the chair that had followed her from the old house into this one, her familiar place for 20 years, and sat down with one hand resting on the rosary she always kept on the armrest. But that afternoon, for the first time in all those years, her fingers didn't move across the beads. She simply left her hand resting on the smooth, rounded wood and sat there beneath the slanting light that came through the curtains, carrying the full weight of her own choices without transferring it into prayers, without sending it upward to heaven, without dividing it with anyone else. She allowed it to remain entirely on her shoulders, a mother who had taught one son to carry everything and taught the other that he had to carry nothing, then found herself surprised when one son walked away and the other went to prison. Outside the window, the neighborhood lights came on, and she remained there for a very long time, her hand motionless over the rosary, learning a lesson that could come at 60 just as easily as it could at 19, that there are burdens no one else can carry for us, not even God. That same week, an envelope arrived at the Bridgeport construction office, addressed to Cole Callahan. There was no return address, but he didn't need one, because he recognized the handwriting the moment he saw it, the evenly slanted, careful script, slightly ornamental in its capital letters, the handwriting that had once filled out birthday cards for him and signed beside his name on the documents for their wedding reception. Whitney. He held the envelope for a while, standing beside the temporary desk set up on the drafty second floor, and he didn't open it. Not because he feared what was inside. He could guess. An apology. Perhaps a long one. Perhaps sincere. The woman had paid enough for the words in that letter to be genuine. He didn't open it because he realized he no longer needed to read it. An apology is something a person needs while the wound is still asking questions about the one who caused it. But Cole's wound had healed in another way. It had healed through bricks, through mortar, through Wednesday afternoons, through a hand placed over his inside the diner downstairs. To tear open that new skin merely to confirm something he already knew wouldn't be forgiveness. It would be making himself bleed again for the sake of ceremony. He pulled open the desk drawer, placed the unopened letter neatly inside, and closed it. Some doors are closed from the outside and then left alone, neither locked nor sealed, simply left undisturbed. And it wasn't because of hatred. Cole understood that better than anyone when his hand moved away from the drawer with such lightness. Because hatred is a fire that must be fed every day. It needs wood, wind, and someone willing to sit beside it and keep watch. Cole had already used all the wood in his life for something else. For rebuilding a building, a name, and a man. And so the other fire, with no one left to feed it, simply went out. The building on the Bridgeport street corner reopened on a Saturday morning in late spring, exactly 2 years after a man who had lost everything signed his name to purchase it with nearly the last dollar he possessed. There were no large banners and no elaborate ribbon-cutting ceremony, only the arched doors thrown wide to welcome the sunlight, the smell of fresh bread rising from the ground floor, the scent of wood and linseed oil drifting down from the second, and people from across the neighborhood gathering until they filled the entire sidewalk in front of a 3-story red brick building that, 2 years earlier, every passerby had assumed was merely waiting to be demolished. The bricks that had once been removed and cleaned now rested again in their original places, their deep red color restored, while the arched windows had been freed from the humiliation of their wooden boards, revealing the proud curves shaped a century before, and high above them, the raised lettering had been carefully restored down to every stroke. Several weeks earlier, a respected architecture magazine had sent a team to the building. They stayed for 2 days, photographing everything from the basement to the rooftop, and that month's issue devoted several full pages to a feature whose headline the entire construction crew passed from hand to hand: "The Man Restoring the Souls of Chicago's Historic Buildings." The article told the story of a small company called Callahan Restoration, of its philosophy that structural integrity should never be sacrificed for appearance, of bricks carefully numbered and arranged on shelves, and of the quiet founder who refused to discuss his past and offered only one sentence, which the magazine printed in italics as the heart of the story. "I didn't save this building. This building and I saved each other." On the morning of the reopening, the moment that caused many people to turn away and wipe their eyes didn't happen at a podium, because there was no podium. It happened on the second floor, outside the new woodworking shop, when Cole led Walt Hagen up the stairs. stopped before an oak door that still carried the fresh scent of oil, and looked up with him at the sign hanging above it. The sign had been recreated from the old man's memories, gathered through countless conversations in which Walt described and Cole drew, with the exact lettering, the exact dark blue paint edged in gold, and even the slight curve in the upper right corner that Walt's father had carved incorrectly long ago and had chosen to preserve as a signature. Hagen & Son, woodworking shop, established by Walt's grandfather on Halsted Street. The 65-year-old craftsman stood before that doorway for a very long time, his arms resting at his sides, his calloused fingers moving slightly as though touching something no one else could see. He said nothing. He merely raised one hand to the brim of his hat, removed it, and held it against his chest, in the way a person salutes something sacred. Then he crossed the threshold and stepped inside, while Cole remained outside and didn't follow, because there are reunions no outsider should witness, not even the man who made them possible. On the ground floor, Marin's diner had been transformed into a warm restaurant 3 times its original size, with a new kitchen and an additional row of tables beneath the arched windows, but the wooden sign still read Marin's Kitchen, rebuilt and repainted by Walt's own hands in the same lettering as before. She had refused to change the name, saying that it had remained beside her through the hardest years of her life and therefore deserved to remain through the most beautiful ones. She stood behind the new counter in a new apron, busy and radiant, directing a kitchen that now had 2 additional workers, and every time she passed a plate across the counter, sunlight from the arched windows caught on the simple ring on her left hand, a slender band of plain gold set with a small stone. Cole had placed it on her finger one winter evening at the table beside the window. He hadn't knelt with ceremony. He had simply placed the small box between 2 cups of coffee and told her that the ring wasn't as expensive as the one he had once bought for someone else, but it possessed one thing the other ring never had. It had been chosen for the right person, from the very beginning. Chosen for hands that were often covered in flour, and for a heart that had never learned how to betray. Marin had laughed as tears fell into her coffee and nodded before he had even finished asking the question. Outside, the little street in front of the building rang with the voices of neighborhood children chasing one another around the newly planted flower beds, their clear laughter rising through the sunlight like a blessing no ceremony could equal. And in another part of the city, a long train ride from Bridgeport, on the Monday morning after the reopening, Whitney Prescott, who had reclaimed her former name, took her place behind the reception desk at a design firm where she worked as a contract employee, a job she wouldn't even have considered 2 years earlier, and now performed carefully each day because it belonged to her, earned through her own effort, the first thing in her life of which that had ever been true. On the glass tabletop, among the magazines arranged for waiting clients, lay an architecture magazine, and from its cover, a red brick building with arched windows seemed to look directly at her. Whitney picked it up, turned to the feature, and read every word from beginning to end, slowly, without skipping a single line. She paused longest over the photograph of the founder standing in the middle of the construction site, his clothes covered in mortar dust, smiling at something beyond the edge of the frame, with a smile she had never once seen during all the years she had spent beside him. Beneath it was a smaller photograph, taken on the reopening day, showing the same man standing in front of the building, with one hand resting gently behind the back of a woman wearing an apron, both of them looking in the same direction. Whitney sat very still. Then she understood, not through reason but with her whole being, something her letter, wherever it now rested, could never change. There was no version of her apology this man needed anymore, not because he was hard, and not because he hadn't forgiven her, but because he had healed. And people who have healed don't need acknowledgement from those who once broke them. They have already traveled far beyond the point where such acknowledgement can change anything. Whitney closed the magazine and returned it to its place on the glass table, straight and neat, as though setting down a chapter of her life. The main telephone rang. She took a breath, lifted the receiver, and spoke in a clear, courteous voice. "Good morning, Hale Design. How may I help you?" Beyond the glass doors, the city continued flowing, filled with people who were breaking and people who were healing, and she continued forward in the only way any person truly can, one day at a time, on her own 2 feet. One Sunday morning at the beginning of summer, before the restaurant on the ground floor had opened, and the only sound in the entire building was the birds beyond the arched windows, Cole Callahan sat alone in his work corner on the 3rd floor, a small room with the largest window in the building, where the early light poured across the wooden desk Walt had built for him with his own hands. On that desk, The worn leather notebook lay open, and Cole slowly turned through the pages. Pages yellowed by the years, pencil lines faded along the edges, buildings drawn during the late nights of another life by a man sitting behind the desk of another world. He stopped at a page near the end, a drawing of a 3-story red brick building with arched windows and raised lettering high above, sketched before he had even placed the deposit to buy it, drawn from the memory of a single drive past. Then he raised his eyes and looked through the window, where the morning light was falling across that very red brick facade, every brick resting in its proper place, every arch curving exactly as it did on the page. The drawing from 15 years earlier now stood outside in the real world, breathing sunlight, casting shadows, holding within it a woodworking shop brought back to life, a restaurant filled each morning with the smell of fresh bread, and a man who had finally been allowed to live inside his own dream, instead of only drawing it in the darkness. He closed the notebook gently, as though closing a chapter that had completed its purpose, and at that exact moment, the sound of the kitchen door opening rose from downstairs, followed by the touch of a pot against the stove, then Marin, humming a wandering melody with no beginning or end, the tune she always sang while lighting the burners, the familiar sounds of a day beginning, of a home with someone inside it. Cole remained still for a little while longer, simply to listen, because there are sounds whose value takes half a lifetime to understand. They had called him Mud. The woman he had intended to marry had looked at the man carrying an entire family on his shoulders, and seen only a stain that needed to be hidden from her friends. His mother had told him to be the bigger person, speaking to him as though he were a child fighting over his share, forgetting that he hadn't been allowed to be a child for a single day since he was 19, that in that house, the oldest person had never been the one seated at the head of the table, but the one who woke earliest, came home latest, and was never permitted to be tired. The younger brother, to whom he had given an entire future, used the very knowledge purchased with Cole's sweat to design the perfect trap and lock him inside it. They took nearly everything from him that could be taken: money, dignity, trust, even the right to sit through a family meal without needing to be cautious. But this was what none of them understood, what perhaps only now, inside a prison cell, inside the silent house on the west side, behind the reception desk of an unfamiliar office, they were beginning to understand dimly. You can't drain a man who knows how to build from ruins, and then act surprised when he rebuilds himself. A man who stood amid his father's funeral at 19, accepted a debt that wasn't his, and repaid it for 15 years without missing a single payment, can only be stripped of what he has at that moment. You can never take away the way he earns it back, because the most valuable part of a person isn't kept inside a safe, written on ownership documents, or held within any corporate structure that can be stolen through a signature. It lives in hands that know how to begin again, and in a heart that, after everything, still dares to choose decency. The story of Cole Callahan ends here. But before we say goodbye, I would like to leave you, the person who stayed with this story until its final moment, with a few thoughts. If there is someone like Cole in your family or in your life, someone who always steps forward to carry the burden and never asks for credit, someone everyone simply assumes is strong, then today, please don't wait until that person breaks before remembering that they can feel pain too. Sit down beside them and ask just one question. Have you been tired lately? Then listen sincerely, because the people who carry burdens in silence don't need repayment. They only need to be seen. And if you are that person, please remember that forgiving those who hurt you doesn't mean you have to become their shield one more time. You can love someone from a distance wide enough for you to remain whole. And that doesn't make you a bad person. It only proves that you have learned to value yourself. Because in the end, the most precious thing a person can build in this life isn't wealth or status, but the person they become, someone who stands upright, lives truthfully, and is at peace with the choices they have made. Thank you for listening to the entire story today. How did this story make you feel? Which detail moved you the most? And if you were Cole, would you choose to forgive in the way he did? Please share the feelings from deep within your heart in the comments, because every line you write is a precious source of encouragement that helps us continue telling meaningful stories. If this story touched you, please leave a like, share this video with your loved ones, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the compelling videos we bring to you each day. We wish you and your family abundant health, a joyful life, and peace and serenity in every day ahead. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.